When we solve percent problems, another option would be to use an equation. We're still going to be looking for a part, a whole, or a percent. We're just going to use an equation to help set that up and do the math. So when we do that, we're going to first need to translate any words into the numbers and symbols that they represent. We're going to want to remember as we do that, that is usually means equals and of usually means multiply. Then once we have our equation, we just solve for the missing amount. So how does that work? How does that look? Well, let's do a couple and see. How much is 35% of 80? So is and of are those two keywords that we're going to be looking for. They're going to give us two key parts. Is, we said, is equals, of is multiply. Then take our numbers like 80 and put that in there, and then 35%. Anytime you do a calculation with a percent, we're going to need to remember that you turn it into either a fraction or a decimal. So 35%, I'm not going to multiply by 35, I'm going to multiply by its decimal or fraction form. So I'm going to come over here and remind myself that 35% equals 0.35, which I got by dividing 35 by 100 so that I can actually do a calculation with it. So I'm going to use 0.35 times 80, and then the piece that I'm missing is the how much. So that's where I'm going to put my variable. So for this problem, very straightforward. I'm just going to multiply 0.35 times 80, and that's going to give me that n value of 28. So 28 would go back in here where the how much is. 28 is 35% of 80. I check to make sure that makes sense, that seems reasonable. It does, because 35% is less than 50% or half of 80, and 28 is less than 40, but it's not super small, which makes sense. All right, so next one. 80 is what percent of 140? So again, I've got my is, which is going to be my equals, of, which will be multiply. So I'm going to start by writing those down. And then 80 is, so 80 is what percent, that's my missing number, so I'm going to use an n for my what percent of 140. So now I have 80 equals something times 140. This one isn't maybe as straightforward as the first example because I don't know what n is. I can't multiply it times 140. I need to kind of think backwards. So this is where we use those inverse operations and we undo. So since I can't multiply, I'm going to undo or do the inverse. I'm going to divide. And I'm going to divide by 140. And if I do it on one side of the equation, I have to do it on the other side as well. So 140 divided by 140, that equals 1. So really on this side I have n times 1. So I don't really need to write the times 1. And on this side I have 80 divided by 140. Now when I do that I get kind of a long decimal, so I'm going to write down part of it here. 0.57142, and it keeps going. Our directions don't specify, but I'm going to go ahead and round this off. But before I do that, I'm going to notice, oh hey, this is what percent. So up here, because we were calculating with a percent, we had to change it into its decimal form. I need to understand that in this problem, this was what we calculated with, so it is the decimal form of the percent. So before I do any other rounding or any other adjusting, the first thing I'm going to do is come over to the side, take this number, or at least a big part of it, or even just leave it in my calculator, and I'm going to multiply it times 100 to turn it back into its percent form. So I've left it in my calculator. I'm going to times it by 100, and I get 57.142, and it kind of keeps going. I'm going to round to my nearest tenth, so that place where the 1 is my tenths place. Behind that is a 4. I'm going to keep 57.1, does not round up because it's a 4, which is less than 5, and so my answer is going to be 57.1%. Oh, I should have circled this one back up here. So that's going to be 80 is 57.1% approximately of 140. All right, and that also makes sense because 57.1%, that's a little more than half, Half of 140 would be 70, and our number we were working with was 80. So that's just a little more than 70, so that seems reasonable. Let's try another one. 95% of what number is 248? So here's my is, here's my of. So I'm going to write down is, put an equal. For of, I'm going to put my times symbol. Is 248. I can go ahead and write that down. That's on the other side there of that equal sign. What number? That's the thing we don't know, so we'll put a variable for that. 95% of what number? So it's 95% times that number we don't know yet. So now again, 95% is a percent. So I'm going to come over here. 95% is equal to 0.95. Change it to its decimal form. And now I've got 0.95 times something equals 248. So just like the last example, I'm going to need to think backwards and use my inverse operation, and I'm going to need to divide that number that's with the variable so I can get that variable by itself. And if I divide on the left-hand side, I have to divide by the same amount on the right-hand side. That's that basic rule of equations that we should have learned in 6th grade. And over here I have 1 times n, or just n. And on the other side I'm going to have 248 divided by 0.95. That's going to give me 261.052 and a bunch of numbers that keeps going. Again, the directions didn't specify, but I'm going to go ahead and round off to my tenths place. So that's 261 point. That's a 0, but behind it's a 5. So I'm going to go ahead and round this and say that's approximately 261.1. And there's my final answer on that one. All right, on these practice problems, before you watch how to solve them, please try them on your own first. So for the first one, we have what is 58% of 325? I'm going to circle those key 2 words, is and of, and go ahead and translate those first. What is 58% of 325? So what is that indicator of? That's what I don't know. So that's where my variable goes. 58% is in percent form. I need to rewrite it in its decimal form, 0.58 times 325. So this is one of those where we just need to do the multiplication. So 0.58 times 325. And I get my n equals 188.5. Final answer, done. Next one. 85 is what percent of 53? So again, I'm going to zoom in on those 2 words and translate those first. 85 is what percent? That what gives me the clue that that's my thing I don't know, of 53. So 85 equals n times 53. If we want to write that a little smaller, we certainly could. 85 equals, and actually I'm going to go ahead and write this the way we would traditionally put the number in front of the variable if we have a number times a variable. So 85 equals 53 times n. I don't need the multiplication symbol, putting them next to each other. We know that means multiply. Since I can't do this, I don't know what n is. This is where we use the inverse operation and divide. To undo this multiplication, I divide by 53. If I do it on this side, I have to do the same thing over here. So 53 divided by 53 leaves me with just 1, or n. And 85 divided by 53, that's something I need to do on my calculator. And when I do that, I get 1.6037. It keeps going, but I'm going to stop there. I don't need that much. Now here's where you need to be careful. I'm going to go back to my question and see that it says what percent. So this is giving me a percent, but I have to remember this is the percent in the form we use to calculate. So this is the decimal form of my percent. So just like over here, I had to take that decimal and multiply it times 100. Over here, I'm going to take this decimal and I'm going to multiply times 100. I'm going to shorten it up just a little bit. And when I multiply that, I get 160.37, it keeps going, percent. So I'm going to round this to my nearest tenth. That's going to be 160.4%. Now I'm going to check because, boy, that seems weird. That's over 100. Does that make sense? 85 is 160% of 53. Is that reasonable? And it actually really is, because 85 is bigger than 53. The percent is going to have to be a percent bigger than 100 because this is actually bigger than this. So that does make sense. All right, 96 is 37% of what number? Oh, let me go back and circle this one. Okay, 96 is 37% of what number? 96 is 37%, but oops, I need to write it as a decimal because I'm going to calculate with it. So I divide that by 100, I get 0.37 of times what number? That's the thing I don't know, n. So now I need to do my inverse operation and divide by the thing that's with the variable so I can get that variable by itself. That's going to leave me with just n on this side, and on the other side I'm going to do 96 divided by 0.37, and that's going to give me 259.459. It kind of keeps going. So I'm going to come over, I've got a little more room here, and I'm going to round that off, 259.45. So I'm going to round that 4 to a 5, and my final answer is going to be 259.5. All right, let's take a look at word problems, because that is honestly where we ultimately need to be able to do this kind of math, is in a real life word problem kind of situation. Hakeem spent 38% of his savings to buy a new bike for his little sister. If the bike cost $35, how much did he have in his savings before buying the bike? So we need to break this down and figure out what is what. All right. He spent 38% of his savings. So let's zoom in on that. That's going to be the percent. Obviously, it's got the percent sign. He spent that of his savings to buy a new bike. That's important information, but it's kind of description as opposed to information we need probably to actually write our equation. So we need to zoom in on 38% of his savings. If the bike cost $35, so the cost was $35, how much did he have in his savings before buying the bike? So how much, here's the question, how much in his savings? So let's break this down. 38% of his savings is what we want to know. And what's the $35? Well, that's what he spent. He spent 38%. This is what he spent because that's what the bike cost. So that $35 is 38% of his savings. I'm just taking all these words and making it into a simpler statement, because now I have my is, I have my of, and I have my three main things that I'm looking for: the part, the percent, and the whole. Now I can translate this into an equation. 35 is equals 38%. I'm calculating with a percent. I need to change it to its decimal form by dividing it by 100 of multiply his savings. That's what we want to know. How much in the savings? So that's our variable. Now we have our simple equation. To find our n, we're going to divide by 0.38 to get our answer. So we're going to take and divide by that 0.38. When we do that, we're left with n on this side. 35 divided by 0.38 is 92.1052. It keeps going, but this is money because this is his savings. So we only need 2 decimal places. So I'm going to round that off to 92.11, but in money, that's $92.11. $92.11. So I'm going to write my final statement. He had $92.11 in his savings before he bought the bike. All right, Kendall. Kendall sold 15 of her baby fish, 15 of the baby fish her favorite guppy just had to her friend. If her guppy had a total of 23 baby fish, what percentage did she sell? So let's break this one down. Kendall sold 15 of the baby fish, all right, that her favorite guppy just had. Well, that's nice information, but that's a description. And who she sold it to, that's also description. So the important key thing is here that she sold 15 of the fish. If her guppy had a total of 23 baby fish, so had a total of 23, what percentage did she sell? So what percentage did she sell? So we're looking for a percentage. We know that she sold 15 out of a total of 23. So let's see if we can write that in a simpler statement. What percent of 23 is 15? That's what we're looking for. What percent out of the total of 23 does the 15 represent? Now I can translate into my equation. What percent, that's my n, of 23 times 23 equals 15. I have something times 23 equals 15. I want to know what that something is, so I do my divide by 23 to get that n alone. I have n equals 15 divided by 23. That equals 0.65217, blah, blah, blah. It keeps going. But this, again, remember, I was looking for a percent. What percentage? This is the decimal form because that's what we used in our calculations. So now I'm going to multiply this by 100, and then I'm going to round. So when I multiply times 100, I get 65.217. It keeps going, and I'm going to round that off to my nearest tenth. So 65.2% of her fish were sold. And there's that final answer.